in listen-only mode.
Welcome. Thank you for joining. This is the November 14th webinar of the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference's Health Policy Committee. I'm Ellen Andrews, consultant to the Health Policy Committee, and we're very fortunate this morning to have Chris Whatley from CSG's Washington office today to help explain what's happening with the Congressional Super Committee and federal budget negotiations. In addition to CSG's national and regional offices, the Council of State Government maintains a Washington, D.C. office that Chris directs. That office monitors and advises CSG members on significant federal issues. Recognizing that national issues may impact CSG's regions differently, the CSG D.C. office strives to represent the interests of CSG's membership both nationally and regionally on major issues before Congress and the administration. CSG encourages its members to use the D.C. office as an ongoing resource to better understand activities taking place in the nation's capital. Chris and his staff serve an incredibly important role for us at CSG, and I call on them a lot, both in advising us about what is happening at the federal level and in helping us get above the noise, which is loud right now, and effectively communicate the needs of states to policymakers there. I've been involved with two incredibly helpful CSG projects that Chris led, one to outline in very specific detail the impact and diverse opportunities for states under the 2009 federal stimulus package, and another working with RAND to outline the impact of last year's national health reform law on states, particularly on states' bottom line. On this webinar, once again, Chris will help us navigate the Super Committee, including the policy, the money, the very important money, and the politics of the process. On average, 22% of state revenues come from the federal government, much of it for health care programs like Medicaid. States are struggling to serve the public in the same lousy economy that the feds are facing, with the added requirement that we have to balance our budgets, by and large. We are extremely lucky to have Chris help us make sense of the Super Committee and guide us through what comes next. So thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Ellen. And I want to thank the whole committee and all those of you who joined on the line here early on a Monday morning. The Health Committee out of CSG East has been really the leader in terms of outreach on federal efforts and health reform. I think that you've done more thought work on its impact for the states than any other component within the CSG family. And Paula Roy and all the committee members have been huge resources for the whole national organization by virtue of the fact that you've spent so much time thoughtfully going through those issues that Ellen just mentioned. But we're here to talk about the Super Committee, which seems to be the only thing talked about on Sunday morning talk shows or in whichever morning news program you like to listen to. And basically, ever since August, we've all been kind of in this waiting for Godot mode of trying to figure out what would happen in Washington in broad terms as a result of this new and kind of mysterious process. And I think I can speak for pretty much everybody I work with that until this process works its way out, everything else in Washington is locked up. And fortunately, we're going to know one way or the other soon, because the deadline that was probably mentioned in the front page of your paper and any other news resource you go to is November 23rd. Really, operationally, the plan, to the extent that a plan is created, has to be finished by 1 week from today, because under House rules, it's got to be written up and published for 48 hours for House members to read. So if we get a product, we're going to get it within a week. So we're in the end game now. And as kind of a lead-in to the things I will say, everything that I listened to over the weekend was extremely skeptical in terms of whether the Super Committee is going to succeed or not. I remain a bit more optimistic than that. And I'll try to go through just kind of the basic components of the process, the political players, the plans themselves, and its state impact to show you why I may be optimistic that the Super Committee will come out with a product. I remain skeptical and concerned about how this process will play out for states, because whether it succeeds or not, there's some very significant squeezes that states are going to feel, and particularly in the health fields. So to begin, it helps to just kind of review the process of why we ended up here. We can all remember back to late July, early August, the grand compromise that the President was trying to negotiate with Congress to do some significant deficit reduction over the next 10 years. all those negotiations deadlocked. The stock market was dropping by 400 points a day. We end up with the Budget Control Act. That's the piece of legislation that created the initial resolution of the debt ceiling impasse. It gave us this $917 billion increase to the debt ceiling by allowing a whole series of specific hard caps on discretionary spending alone over the next 10 years, all of it drawn from a piece of legislation that would be familiar to anyone who was tracking federal legislation in the 80s, the Gramm-Rudman Budget Control Act. In fact, this piece of legislation passed last August is just an amendment to that old 1980s piece of legislation. So that's how we got here. It set up a series of cuts to give us some initial breathing room under the debt ceiling, and it set up a process. And at the heart of that process was this new super committee, which was tasked to come up with at least $1.2 trillion worth of savings over the next 10 years, or at least deficit savings. And unlike the initial $900 billion round that we got in August, which was just discretionary spending, this one set up this process with this unique super empowered group of individuals with the idea being that they would be able to touch all three rails of this political process. They would be able to deal with mandatory spending, discretionary spending, and the revenue side. And most importantly, if you read the 75-page Budget Control Act, most of it is about legislative process and setting up an expedited mechanism to allow this, whatever they came out with, to be voted up in an up or down vote. Literally, the Senate can pass it with 51 votes. So all of the kind of supermajority requirements you have on the Senate side, they all fall away. You have no ability to amend this. This just goes in exact form straight to both chambers. If it can get simple majorities there, it's passed into law. Now, if it fails, that's where this other kind of boogeyman that's talked about on the Sunday morning talk shows, sequestration, comes in. And really what this does is it kind of takes that $900 billion series of cuts that we got in August and have already been factored into federal thinking right now as we deal with the approach bills that are still kind of locked up right now. We're already thinking about, for the next 10 years, we're going to have to shave off that $900 billion worth of projected spending. Under sequestration, really that exact approach continues on forward at an even steeper rate for the next 10 years. It's really a series of cuts that are almost exclusively focused on discretionary spending. There's some tiny 2% cuts that can be made to Medicare, but really it's focused on the discretionary side. So that's how we got here. That's why the Super Committee is important. That's why everybody's watching it, because whatever they put out goes straight to the floor like a rocket, and can get passed in ways that federal legislation can't. All right, and that gets us to the personalities. When the legislation set up the process for selecting these committee members, and for the next month, everyone was just kind of speculating as to who is going to be on this committee. And when we finally got the roster, I think the reaction in town, for the most part, was this is kind of the motley mix of people. It's not who you would necessarily put together if you were going to try to reach a compromise easily. A lot of the Gang of Six members, they were coming out with proposals for steep deficit reduction. Six Democrats and Republicans. They're not there. People like Coburn on the Republican side, Warner on the Democratic side. So there were a lot of personalities who you thought would be necessary to get to yes that weren't included, and then others who were viewed really more as kind of foot soldiers of their party leadership were here in the mix. And even the leaders were people who had never worked together in any way, shape, or form. So that's kind of where we got, where our reaction was to the folks who were selected. But I would say despite that, and despite all of the concerns that have been expressed about this, screeching towards failure, I think that as a group, they've worked pretty successfully. Up until the last 2, maybe 3 weeks, they have been leak-free. And in fact, even now, it's not so much people leaking and sniping at each other. It's just we're at the point where people start offering up their proposals. And yes, they are leaked to the press. They're trial balloon. But I think as a group, they've functioned relatively well. But we are starting to see some clear breakouts as to who's who on this process. And I'll start with kind of 4 categories. The first would be the loyalists, the folks who you knew going into this that they were going to follow a line and have acted with some exception pretty much along those lines. And those would be Becerra, Clyburn, and Toomey. Excuse me, and John Kyle, not Toomey. Toomey's a big difference. The other ones would be the tax reformers. That would be Camp, Toomey, and Upton, who have come into this with a clear agenda. They certainly are conservatives. You would put them in the loyalist camp, but they're viewing this as a historic process that will enable them to move a strategic agenda that they have for tax reform that lies at the heart of their identity. You know, Camp is chair of Ways and Means. Upton, he's more of a moderate compromiser, but he's close friends with Camp. He's also a Ways and Means guy. And then Toomey, who was up until recently leading the Club for Growth, who views tax reform as his raison d'etre. So you've got the tax reforming camp. That's kind of the second category. The third category are just the leaders. Hensarling, Murray, Van Hollen themselves. They're the ones who've been going on to the Sunday morning talk shows and largely talking in kind of peace-building language, showing that they still are optimistic about getting to a result. They've invested a lot of time in developing their relationships among the committee members themselves, and also trying to clue in the rest of the leadership, you know, of their chamber leaderships into this process. And in fact, I think it's been one of the most telling things in this process is Nancy Pelosi has largely been absent. You've had Chris Van Hollen working with Steny Hoyer, really representing kind of the House Democratic side. Harry Reid, very much a direct role, you know, working with Patty Murray. Boehner seems to be glued to the hip with Hensarling. So those are our leaders. But throughout all this, you know, the political pundits were primarily just kind of handicapping who would break out from their party. Because if you can get a report and you can get one Democrat to switch sides or one Republican to switch sides, you can get a 7-5 vote, report this to the floor, and who knows what happens at that point. So everyone has been kind of focused on who's going to break ranks. And I think that for the most part, there aren't a lot of people in town who are really convinced that you're going to get a 7-5 vote, that for the most part it seems like there's a consensus process going on, and that if you get a report at all, it will probably be a stronger group voting in favor of it instead of just one maverick breaking out. But if you want to guess as to who might be one of those mavericks, or also who might be playing the key deal-making role, I would put it on these 3 gentlemen. On your right there, you've got Senator Portman. He's just come to the Senate, you know, just won his race in Ohio. But House Ways and Means guy in the past, OMB director. I think by many estimations, the smartest guy in the Senate, and certainly the person who understands this process and the ramifications for America's fiscal trajectory better than anybody else. He seems to be really the thought leader in the committee as a whole, and playing a key kind of role in convincing others and selling plans to others. So it's not so much that he's going to break off and vote with a Democratic plan, but he seems to be playing the key role in trying to bring others onto the Republican side, certainly. Then you've got Kerry. He's probably the one I was most mystified about in being selected for the committee itself. But he's a guy who views himself as kind of tragic to history, you know, almost became president, looking to have an impact on a major national event when he's kind of in the twilight of his Senate career. He's probably going to be around for a good while longer. Senators stay with us a long time. But clearly he inserted himself in this process, even though he doesn't really have a domestic policy track record. He's never been a tax or finance guy. You know, he's a foreign policy leader, but he did everything he can, pulled all his chips with Harry Reid to get on this committee. He wants a deal. He doesn't want this to fail. He wants to be a part of the success, and as a result, seems to be playing a disproportionate role in this process. And then finally, you got Baucus. Baucus is the guy who, when Bush was elected and inaugurated in 2001, within a couple of months, he went to visit him personally and say, I want to help you champion your tax reform package. Even though he's a Democrat, you know, moderate Democrat from Montana, Senate Finance Committee chair, key guy, and someone who has a definite track record of working with the Republican side and certainly closer to them in their visions for the mix of revenue cuts or revenue increases versus tax cuts. He's also someone who I would say has not been shy to make cuts to programs that mean a lot to states from time to time. Not that he doesn't care about the interests of states. He's a former state legislator himself. But when the Recovery Act was moving to passage and they needed $50 billion in extra money, they took that out of programs that benefited state budgets directly, and it was Baucus leading that fight on the floor who did it. So he's someone who I view as, if anyone's going to flip in this, it would probably be Baucus. All right, and that gets to the plans. All of these plans share some common elements. All of them have kind of their DNA in the Simpson-Bowles Commission or the Gang of Six plans or the Grand Compromise. We know what needs to go into this kind of mix of cuts and revenue increases to get to a big number of deficit reduction. So there's anything unique that we were expecting to have happen. But everything that we've ultimately seen so far has basically drawn from those existing plans. It's cut off about $900 billion to $1 trillion off of the original number, because we've already programmed in $900 billion worth of cuts as a result of the Budget Control Act. And they kind of rely on three key elements that you would find even in most state budget exercises. They revolve on cuts, revenue, and fiction. And to give you a sense of where we are in that kind of mix, you start with Baucus releasing his $3 trillion plan at the end of October, right as we're going towards Halloween. He relies on a preponderance of revenue increases, $1.3 trillion, $1 trillion in war savings. That's fiction. That's an element that can't really be counted by the Congressional Budget Office. And then the rest he balances out, $700 billion worth of cuts, including some very substantial ones to Medicare and Medicaid, the really tough political cell cuts for Democrats. Boehner responds, and it's interesting. It isn't anyone from the Super Committee. It's Boehner who responds. It shows how tied in his committee members are to leadership, with $2.2 trillion, which basically is solidly $1.6 trillion in cuts and $600 billion in fiction. His fiction is dynamic scoring of how proposed tax reforms, which would happen at a later date, would lead to economic growth, which would cause tax revenues to increase. You can't really score that. There isn't a real linear relationship between any particular tax reform you may offer and the economy growing in some massive way. If it were that easy, we would have already put in those tax reforms and be reaping the benefits from them. So those were the first rounds of proposals. You then have both sides essentially dial down their proposal by $700 billion and come back to the table with a much more even mix. So the Democrats respond about a week and a half ago with a $2.3 trillion plan. This time they shave off their revenue ask. They make it a true even plan of $1 trillion in cuts, $1 trillion in revenue, and then $300 billion in interest savings. That is a legitimate cut that CBO will count. Republicans counter as well. Their offer is $700 billion below what their original Boehner response was. And once again, they've moved. And this time I would say that they've moved much more than the Democrats have. We've gone from no cuts, no revenue, just cuts and fiction as the original Boehner plan, to a plan that you've got $600 billion in revenue, and some of that is hard revenue. Some of the $300 billion of that is actual cuts, revenue that's achieved by cutting some of the tax deductions. The other $300 billion or so are fee increases and sale of public lands and a whole kind of mishmash of different one-timers that get you $300 billion. But still, to come out with a plan that is essentially $800 billion in cuts, $600 billion in revenue, and then the rest interest savings, that is a huge move off of their original plan. And this is why I still remain guardedly optimistic that we're going to get something out here. Okay, the politics. Most of everybody's heard about this. You got the deficit hawks and the security hawks. You got Rand Paul on one side. You got Lindsey Graham on the other. You've got a real debate going on within Republican ranks themselves as to whether whether you're willing to sacrifice the kind of investments we've made in our national security posture in order to make the cuts we need to deal with our deficit. And that's driving the politics around us. And on top of that, you've got the funny season going on. You've got the Republican primary debates going on as a background factor, and everyone focusing on the 2012 cycle. Everybody seems to be handicapping this to fail right now. That would be probably the clear consensus off of every editorial page. But you get back to what sequestration is at its heart. And this is one of the reasons why I'm still optimistic, is sequestration is this strange little legislative mechanism that was carried forward from a piece of legislation that was smack dab out of the 1980s, when you still had Tip O'Neill as a speaker, when the Democrats were powerfully in control of Congress, and the Reagan administration was having to react to them and hope for the best that they could get. Sequestration preserves all of the programs that are of greatest import to the Democratic constituency. It places spending categories like defense in jeopardy that the Republicans care the most about. And as a result, it is weighted politically to the Democratic side of the House because it was born in a period in which the Democrats had the majority, had an overwhelming majority in Congress. And as a result, I think it's if we fall back on sequestration, if you had to handicap who wins or who loses, the whole process loses, the whole town loses. But in terms of preserving interest going forward, I think the Democrats are better preserved. It gives the Republicans the incentive to act, and I think that's why they moved the way they have in the last 2 weeks. Okay, the other reaction is, oh, it's going to fail, and then the Congress is going to intervene. You've got John McCain, who's already written some legislation and he's shopping it around that we're going to nullify the trigger, we're going to preserve the defense budget. I don't think you're going to be able to do that. Quite frankly, I don't think that you'd be able to get the votes to nullify sequestration. The president's already said he'd veto it. And even if you did, it would just throw us back into another debt ceiling crisis, exactly like we had in July and early August. So I personally think that the sequestration is going to be pushed to the side, is a hard lift. And as a result, the calculus in most folks' minds is, do I want a deal from the Super Committee or do I want sequestration? I got to be prepared to live with it. And that's why you've had this happen. You've had 100 House members sign a letter saying that they want both cuts and revenue to be on the table. 36 Grover pledge signers are part of the 40 Republicans who signed that. Without that letter, I don't think that you would have had the plan come out that was trial ballooned last week with the $600 billion in revenue, which, quite frankly, the spokesperson they used for the plan was Toomey, Club for Growth guy. So as a result, I'm still guardedly optimistic that a week from now we're going to have something. A lot of the other things that people have said are indications it's all going to fail. The fact that they've not been able to send anything to CBO for scoring. Everything that they can propose, every component that they can put in a plan has already been scored a la carte by CBO through this kind of 6-month process of dealing with a debt ceiling. So I don't think that that is a showstopper. I think that CBO can pull out from its bag of tricks existing scores it's done on the components that would go into any plan. So I still think that we can get there. Am I confident optimist? No, but I think that they'll probably get something done. All right. So let's assume that they do. And let's compare what's happened so far with the $900 billion worth of cuts that we had in the agreement in August with the scenarios that might happen if they do reach a compromise versus if sequestration comes into mix. And to do so, we really have to focus on the category of spending that gets squeezed the most no matter what, and that's that discretionary category. Roughly $1 trillion out of the $3.5 trillion we spend. It's about evenly divided between security spending, meaning the Department of Defense is the largest, but also the State Department, our national security posture. That's $500 billion and change, and then everything else that we do: the Department of Education, the Department of Energy, transportation spending, non-mandatory health spending. All of that is in the domestic discretionary side. So let's look. We start off of a hard base. The Budget Control Act takes the base level of spending for for 10, which was $1.05 trillion, and puts caps in place to limit its growth. So this red line here is what the CBO baseline was back in July, saying this is where federal spending is going through 2012 if we do nothing. We then got the Budget Control Act. We shaved the curve a bit. So you have a tiny dip in actual federal spending, about $8 billion or so in 2012 that we are cutting off of the total discretionary level in the year before. But mainly what we're doing is we're reducing the growth of the curve in order to shave off that $900 billion. All right, let's assume that there is a compromise. And my assumption would be if we reach a compromise, it's going to have maybe $300 billion worth of scorable revenue in it. The rest is going to be cuts and interest savings. If we get that kind of balanced package come in, this is about what you'll see. You'll have a couple of years at the front end where we'll spend in absolute terms less than what we spent in 2011, but it largely just shaves the curve a little bit further. There's nothing dramatic on the cut side. It doesn't have a massive impact on our overall direction of spending because we're still going to be spending more in 2021 than we did in 2011. But there's some substantial flattening without any drama. Here's what sequestration does. You hit 2013, which is when it goes into effect, and you drop by $100 billion worth of spending. And that's exactly what it does, is in the legislation itself, it sets the absolute limit of discretionary spending in statute. So I know for sure that if sequestration hits, that the total discretionary spending for the federal government in the year 2013 will be $957 billion, even though it was $1.05 trillion in FY11. That $100 billion drop is a heck of an elevator ride. And you see the curve. You know, we ultimately end up spending more in 2021 than we did in 2011, but we have a whole delta in there of deep cut years, and as a result, that's where you get into us having to restructure fundamentally America's armed forces, changing commitments that we have. You could see another round of base closures nationwide. You would also see just massive cuts to discretionary grant programs affecting states. And that's where we get to what it all means for our folks. Either way, whether we get the grand compromise or whether we get sequestration, we're going to get squeezed. It's just a question of where the squeeze comes from. Does it come from pass-through grants where states have a touch, but they're also ultimately passing it out to school districts or passing it out to social service providers, or does it come in a form that affects the actual general fund bottom line? State and local governments own the lion's share of discretionary grant programs, so certainly a sequestration process would squeeze them massively. 40% of that non-defense discretionary dollars ultimately flows through state accounts, whether that's Title I education money or whether it's competitive grant programs on transportation, whether it's some of the grant side of Health and Human Services. It's a huge amount, and all of this is going to take a 20% plunge in the event of sequestration at a minimum. And that truly is at a minimum, because generally what happens is if you squeeze the federal budget by 10%, they squeeze their grant output by maybe 40%, in part because they've got this federal workforce. They can't just slough it off overnight. You know, you can do things like salary freezes and attrition measures to reduce your workforce. But in general, if you are forced to do line-by-line cuts, which is what the sequestration process would require you to do, program-by-program cuts, then grants are going to be squeezed even more than the rest of the federal budget. So, under sequestration, if you're a school district, watch out. If you're in the Medicaid side, you're in a lot better shape. Now, on the Super Committee front, if we do get a compromise, what we know for sure is Medicaid's already on the table. You know, you've got a series of plans, you know, kind of bookmarked the lowest level of cuts that the Democrats have made in any of the plans that have been floated so far, around $50 billion. The high mark so far from the Republicans have been more in the $200 billion category. $100 billion is the number that the White House has put forward all through their summer negotiations. That's the figure you get if you do blended rate, if you do clawback of provider taxes that states rely on, and a few other measures. I think $100 billion is the assumed rate. I mean, if you've already got the White House on board saying they want it, you've already had a number of Democratic plans over the summer and through this process that have given that kind of number or higher. So you just got to assume that you're going to deal with a cut of that size as at a minimum. And any time that you mess with Medicaid, you blend FMAP into CHIP, whatever you want to do, if you mess with it, you mess with state general funds. So this is kind of where we're left. I remain guardedly optimistic that we're going to get some kind of report out of the Super Committee, that it's not going to be an abject failure. But I know that states are going to get hurt either way. Certainly Medicaid cuts hurt states most immediately, but even if we go to sequestration and do these discretionary spending changes, ultimately Medicaid's going to get squeezed too, because if you remove 20, 30, 35% of Title I education money, special education money that are flowing through to state budgets, states are going to have to backfill that. I mean, under your state constitution, you have to provide that level of education to those underserved schools or to those special education students. You're going to backfill that. Even the federal government, if they pull back, and they will pull back, you got to find those dollars on somewhere, or else you get taken to court, and the court tells you how to spend your budget. So either one of these is going to cause stress to the kind of programs that everybody on the line here either oversees or runs. And with that, that's all I've got. We will know one way or the other within a week, but we're living through interesting times, and I thank you for being on the line.
Well, Chris, that's I'm going to have questions for you, and I'm so glad you put up your email address, because I'm going to be asking you questions for the next week, and probably more even after that. So just some housekeeping. If you're listening on the phone, remember to input your audio PIN. It should be visible on your screen if you want to be able to talk and ask questions. You can raise your hand to ask a question, or you can type your question into the question pane text box on your screen at any time. So I'm going to take a prerogative and ask a question. I really appreciate you pointing out that sequestration is not the savior of Medicaid, because it goes back into a general fund, which is fluid, and there will be pressures in every state, because Medicaid is not a grant, it's a matching program, and states have to put up the money, have to spend the money actually. They have to have the cash to spend the money to get the match back. And states are cutting their Medicaid programs now without sequestration or cuts or anything happening. So I appreciate you pointing that out, because there are just too many people thinking we just don't need to worry about this if we're thinking about Medicaid. You had talked about a GAO report a while ago, that this was a potential compromise, or part of a compromise, that if there's a downturn in the economy based on unemployment or wages, that they might be a trigger to increase the FMAP. Do you want to talk about that, and do you think that's still possible?
Well, it's just come out last week. The GAO was asked to do a study as a result of the Recovery Act, or at least it's just come to my attention as of this last week. The GAO was asked to do a study of talking about the potential and the value of having a trigger within the Medicaid program, that if 26 or more states were to experience substantial unemployment, and you can define what that unemployment event would be, that there would be an automatic increase in FMAP rates, nationwide to all 50 states. There would be some sort of trigger event defined, and in this case it's unemployment, that would cause FMAP rates to go up by a set percentage term. And it would probably be like the Recovery Act, where the worst affected states would get the biggest FMAP bump, but even the states in the best shape, like North Dakota, would still get an increase too. Politically, if you put in a trigger like that, you got to increase all 50 states' payments. Where I think it intersects with this process is, this report's just come out. It's talked about this kind of counter-cyclical trigger. You've got the patient advocacy community and a lot of state folks who've been calling for this kind of measure. This has been a key ask of the state community in past years, this exact kind of mechanism. And it's being put out there and highlighted at the very moment that you've got the Super Committee dealing with some very substantial cuts to Medicaid. And one way, and this is just my political speculation, but one way to make those cuts to Medicaid more palatable to their interest communities would be to tie them to this kind of cyclical trigger, because the trigger itself wouldn't be scored. I don't think it's scoreable. Because it's dependent on future events that are hard to calculate if you're a CBO budget analyst. So you book in the $100 billion worth of cuts to Medicaid over the next 10 years, because those are specific hard cuts that you know about. You put this trigger in place, which could conceivably, 5 years from now, if we have another major downturn, cause Medicaid spending to go up. But since you can't be sure that downturn is going to be happening, or no real way to estimate that, you don't get penalized for the potential future spending that would come out of a trigger like that. So I could see that being attractive to, particularly if you need to bring Clyburn and Becerra on board in the Super Committee context, and they're the ones who were most concerned about touching any of the mandatory programs. Something like that could be folded in at the last minute.
Just one sort of simple question based on it. Would the increase in the FMAP, you said that it would vary, every state would get something, but it would be based on how much unemployment rose or wages went down? Because, we have people from all over the country on this call, but for the eastern states, only 2 of our states are above the national average in unemployment rate, but 7 of our states are in a worse budget deficit as a percentage of state revenue than the national average. So I don't, unemployment is sort of a blunt instrument. It isn't the perfect.
I think it's a very fair point. I think that they would likely stick with unemployment as the trigger. They used that as the justification trigger for the Recovery Act FMAP increase and the FMAP increase we did in the 2002 recession, when back then it was about a $20 billion total FMAP cost increase that states got. And similarly, using unemployment as kind of the metric. I agree with you. I think that it is a pretty blunt instrument. And also, you still get into this situation of providing FMAP relief to states who probably don't even need it, like North Dakota being the kind of example. But the political argument that would be made on the other side is, if we tie this to state fiscal health, then we lose control of the decision. That states can make poor fiscal choices, and sure they do it from time to time, that have nothing to do with their current economic environment, that have to do with choices that policymakers make. And Washington doesn't like having their agenda driven by the State House, unfortunately. So I think that they would probably gravitate more to unemployment as a metric, saying that it is a macroeconomic condition that can be tracked and operationalized, that isn't dependent on policy processes in these 50 states.
I guess I can see that. I don't like it, but I can see that. Can you talk also just, and this is going to be the end of my question, so if anybody has one, they should type it in or raise your hand. Can you talk just generally about the strength of states? I'm sure that this is, a free-for-all in terms of lobbyists down there, but do you think that states are really being heard in terms of the pain that they're feeling, which is very similar to, the economic pain that the feds are feeling? But again, we have to balance our budgets.
I don't think that they are. I think that in part the state community is politically divided right now. That you have, there isn't a clear voice articulating a unified state agenda. For us as CSG, we've always been an organization that prides itself in allowing 4 different regional points of view to be heard, and that's been great in this process where you've got a deeply divided country. that we can get some consensus among our regions to ask for things that we wouldn't be able to ask for on a national level. You've got NCSL and NGA that have scaled back their lobbying presence in part because their members are divided. As a result of the 2010 election cycle, you've have a whole range of new legislative chamber leadership that have come in and new governors, and I think that they have scaled back their national lobbying presence considerably and logically as a result of having new members and needing a new mandate from those members. So as a result, if I were to say where is the clear voice from the states or where is the most audible voice, it's coming from the partisan government organizations. It's coming from RGA and DGA that are asking for very different things. So I think that it's quite frankly easier for Washington to ignore states as an interest body than to listen to them. And when we as states ourselves are conflicted in what we want from Washington, whether we're happy with Medicaid as a block grant program, which is what the Republican Governors Association ask is, 29 governors on that letter, or whether it's deep concern for its preservation because you've built very substantial Medicaid programs serving very large patient populations under the current system, as you have in the Northeast and in selected other states around the country. If we don't have a clear national ask among the state community, it's hard to have a decisive voice in the policy process.
Interesting. Lots of thoughts running through my head, and I need to talk to my committee further. Well, seeing that there aren't any questions, I want to thank you so much, Chris. The slides and the video of this webinar will be posted on our website and also at CSG East. I believe that slides are already posted there. And if you have any questions, you can contact me or Chris. Chris has conveniently left his email address there. He will be sorry he did that. And I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank everybody on the line.
Great.